There is a lie that the music industry has told for over 100 years. It goes like this: if you make a hit record, you make a great living. If you top the charts, you die comfortable. OKeh Records was home to some of the most electrifying voices in soul, blues, and R&B history. Artists who packed theaters, appeared on national television, and watched their records climb to the top of the Billboard charts. And then they died broke, forgotten, alone, in poverty. This isn't a story about bad luck. It's a story about a system that was designed to keep black artists performing while someone else collected the money.
I got a girl named Bonnie Maroney.
Today, we're counting down 10 OKeh Records legends who topped the charts and died with nothing. Every fact in this video is verified. Every death is documented. Every chart position is real. Let's begin. Number 10, Chuck Willis.
See what you has done. Yeah.
Before there was James Brown, before there was Otis Redding, there was Chuck Willis. Born Harold Willis in Atlanta, Georgia on January 31st, 1926. Chuck was one of the most gifted singer-songwriters of the early R&B era. He could write a ballad that broke your heart and a groove that wouldn't let your feet stop moving, sometimes in the same song.
Has come.
He signed with Columbia Records in 1951 and was quickly moved to their OKeh subsidiary.
I need a good girl. I won't be back.
Over the next 5 years at OKeh, Chuck Willis racked up hit after hit on the R&B charts. 14 chart entries between 1952 and 1958, 10 of which broke the top 10. He was known as the King of the Stroll because his records inspired the most popular dance in America. Schools were teaching kids how to do the stroll in gym class. That's how big he was. His 1957 recording of CC, Rider for Atlantic Records, hit #1 on the R&B chart. It sat there for 2 full weeks and crossed over to number 12 on the pop chart. Massive numbers for a black artist in the segregated music industry of 1957. Then came What Am I Living For in early 1958, another #1 R&B smash, the biggest R&B record of the entire year of 1958, according to Billboard's year-end chart. It was also, historians note, the first rock and roll record ever released in stereo, engineered by Tom Dowd of Atlantic Records. But here is what nobody told you in school. Chuck Willis died on April 10, 1958, just weeks after What Am I Living For hit #1. He was 32 years old. The cause was peritonitis, a bacterial infection of the abdominal lining, following surgery for stomach ulcers. He died while his record was still at the top of the charts. His estate received almost nothing. In the 1950s, black artists routinely signed contracts that paid them flat session fees with no royalty provisions or royalty structures so exploitative they amounted to the same thing.
I could just walk with you. Everything.
Chuck Willis died having produced 2 of the biggest records of the decade and leaving almost nothing behind. Chuck Willis was inducted into the Georgia Music Hall of Fame in 2004, 46 years after they let him die broke. Number 9, Big Maybelle.
Scared of you.
Better stop trying.
Her voice was like a freight train wrapped in velvet. Mabel Louise Smith, known to the world as Big Maybelle, was born on May 1st, 1924 in Jackson, Tennessee.
To run my business.
By the age of 8, she had already won an amateur singing contest in Memphis. By her teens, she had left the church and was singing secular R&B with professional orchestras. She signed with OKeh Records in 1952 and released Gabbin' Blues, a fierce, funny, full-throated duet that hit number 3 on the R&B chart. It was followed by 2 more top 10 R&B hits during her OKeh years.
About nobody.
I even know when you were born.
And she did something else at OKeh that history has largely forgotten. In 1955, before Elvis Presley, before Jerry Lee Lewis made it famous, Big Maybelle recorded the original version of Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On.
Cool. That's a threat.
It'll be so hot to...
She recorded it first, 2 years before it became a white rock and roll sensation. A black woman from Tennessee had already cut the definitive version and received almost none of the credit or money.
Can't go on.
So hot now, child, you can't go back home.
She left OKeh for Savoy Records in 1955, where her recording of Candy became her biggest pop hit, reaching number 11 R&B in 1956.
I laughed at him as a seal.
Your face is laugh material.
She performed at the 1958 Newport Jazz Festival, captured in the classic documentary film Jazz on a Summer's Day, one of the most electrifying performances in the entire film.
Can't go on.
So hot now, child, you can't go back home. Police look.
But by the early 1960s, heroin addiction had begun to consume her life and her career. She kept recording for Brunswick, Scepter, Chess, and Rojak, and scored one final hit in 1967 with a cover of 96 Tears. But by then, the good years were gone.
Too much space.
Big Maybelle died on January 23, 1972 at Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital. The cause was a diabetic coma. She had been in deteriorating health for 18 months prior. She was 47 years old.
That's a threat.
It'll be so hot you can't.
She had been making music professionally for 36 years. She died with almost nothing.
If you don't keep cool, honey.
Keep cool.
In 1999, her OKeh recording of Candy received a Grammy Hall of Fame award. In 2011, she was inducted into the Blues Hall of Fame. Neither of those honors came with a check. They never do.
So stop any clock.
Well, stop trying.
Listen, 90% of you watching these videos right now ain't subscribed yet. If these stories are blowing your mind, imagine what you're missing. Hit subscribe, turn on that bell, and join the R&B fans who never miss a Groove Lens upload. Number 8, Ted Taylor.
Wonderful.
Few voices in soul history were as immediately recognizable as Ted Taylor's. That piercing, aching falsetto, stretched to its absolute limit, then stretched a little further, was unlike anything else on radio in the 1960s.
Stay as you are.
Critics compared him to Little Willie John and Clyde McPhatter. Fans simply called him different.
Who can break my heart?
Born Theodore Taylor in Okmulgee, Oklahoma on February 16, 1934, Ted moved to California as a teenager and joined a gospel group called the Mighty Clouds of Joy. From gospel, he transitioned to doo-wop, singing in a group called the Soul Seekers, who eventually split into 2 separate recording outfits, the Cadets and the Jacks, both recording for the Modern Records family of labels. Then Ted went solo and spent almost a decade bouncing between labels. Melotone, Duke, Warwick, Top Rank, Lori, releasing records that charted regionally but never broke nationally.
Stay sweet and
Carl Davis signed him to OKeh Records in 1962. Davis released Taylor's debut OKeh album, Be Ever Wonderful, in 1963. Beautiful record, no national chart action. Then in 1965 came Stay Away From My Baby. That loping 6/8 groove, Taylor's falsetto riding it like a man begging for mercy. Climbed to number 14 on the Billboard R&B chart, his only national pop chart entry at number 99. 3 OKeh albums, 1 national chart hit, a voice that deserves so much more.
Wonderful.
When Carl Davis left OKeh, Taylor moved to Jewel Records and then to the Ron label, where he spent nearly a decade releasing regional Southern soul hits, none of which crossed over nationally. In 1983, he recorded his last single on a small label called Watt City. It was titled I'm Leaving You. He was leaving more than a relationship. On October 23, 1987, Ted Taylor died in a car accident in Lake Charles, Louisiana. He was 53 years old. He left behind a body of recorded work that soul collectors across 3 continents call extraordinary. He left behind almost no financial legacy. Ace Records in the UK eventually compiled his OKeh recordings on a reissue album. The title they gave it, The Ever Wonderful Ted Taylor. Wonderful, yes, but it came 30 years too late to do him any good. Number 7, Larry Williams. John Lennon loved Larry Williams. He said so publicly, repeatedly, and with genuine reverence. She's as skinny as a stick of macaroni. The Beatles covered his songs multiple times. Slow Down, Dizzy Miss Lizzie, Bad Boy, songs that define Lennon's rock and roll identity. And Larry Williams died of a gunshot wound to the head in his own garage. That's exactly what I want to do. Born Lawrence Eugene Williams in New Orleans on May 10, 1935, Larry moved to Oakland as a teenager and broke into the music business the hard way, working as Lloyd Price's personal valet before picking up sessions with Roy Brown and Percy Mayfield. Underneath the apple tree. In 1957, he signed with Specialty Records, the same label Little Richard had just abandoned to become a preacher, and Art Roop saw him as the ready replacement. Larry's first single, Short Fat Fanny, shot to number 1 on the R&B chart and number 5 pop in the summer of 1957. It was followed immediately by Boney Maroney, number 4 R&B, number 14 pop. 2 massive hits in 1 year. He was 22 years old. Then a drug conviction in 1960 sent him to prison for 3 years. When he came out, the landscape had changed. Specialty dropped him. The British invasion was covering his old songs and making millions, while he made nothing. He landed at OKeh Records in the mid-1960s, making love underneath the apple tree, where he worked as both a recording artist and a producer, producing sessions for Little Richard and co-producing with Johnny Guitar Watson. The OKeh recordings showed a man still capable of brilliant work, but the commercial moment had passed. He briefly returned to Little Richard's orbit, helping stage his extravagant live shows. But accounts from that period describe a man increasingly volatile, driven by drug addiction and financial desperation. On January 2, 1980, Larry Williams was found dead in the garage of his Los Angeles home with a gunshot wound to the head. He was 44 years old, officially ruled a suicide, though the circumstances were disputed and some associates believed otherwise. The man whose songs filled Beatles albums and defined early rock and roll died with nothing and in violence. Lennon was shot dead 11 months later. In a different kind of cruelty, they almost went together. Number 6. Walter Jackson.
I'm all alone.
Luther Vandross, one of the most celebrated vocalists of the 20th century, was asked once who his favorite singer was. Without hesitation, he said, "Walter Jackson. He was my favorite singer. Not Marvin Gaye, not Sam Cooke, Walter Jackson."
Suddenly,
Born in Pensacola, Florida on March 19, 1938, Walter contracted polio as a small child. He spent the rest of his life on crutches and spent that same life producing some of the most emotionally devastating soul music ever committed to tape. He sang in Detroit nightclubs and failed an audition for Motown before Carl Davis discovered him at a lounge called The Flame in 1962. Davis moved him to Chicago, signed him to Columbia, and then transferred him to OKeh, where Curtis Mayfield stepped in as songwriter and co-producer.
only yesterday I held you in.
Their first collaboration, It's All Over, reached number 67 pop in 1964. It was followed by Suddenly I'm All Alone, number 13 R&B. Welcome Home, number 15 R&B. It's an Uphill Climb to the Bottom, number 11 R&B.
Suddenly,
16 R&B chart hits, 7 pop chart entries, 3 full albums on OKeh, all of them featuring that deep, resonant, perfectly controlled baritone that all music described as Iceman soul, cool on the surface, burning underneath. He was known as the king of smooth Chicago soul. He recorded all the way into the early 1980s, scoring a late career hit with Feelings in 1976 that reached number 9 R&B.
only yesterday I
Walter Jackson died of a cerebral hemorrhage on June 20th, 1983. He was 45 years old. He had been recording professionally for over 20 years. He had scored 16 R&B hits.
today. Suddenly,
Luther Vandross called him his favorite singer. He died at 45, and history barely noticed.
forever must have came.
Number 5, Major Lance. In the summer of 1963, a dancer from the Cabrini Green housing projects of Chicago became a million-selling recording star seemingly overnight. Major Lance, born Malachi Alfonso Lance on April 4, 1939, in Winterville, Mississippi, had grown up alongside Curtis Mayfield and Otis Leavill in one of Chicago's toughest neighborhoods. Before music, he boxed. Before he recorded, he danced on local television. He showed up at Carl Davis's OKeh office for 2 years, running errands, making coffee, doing whatever it took to stay close to a dream. Davis finally signed him in 1962 on Mayfield's recommendation. His second OKeh single, The Monkey Time, hit number 2 on the R&B chart and number 8 pop in the summer of 1963. It was OKeh's first genuine hit in a decade. Mayfield had written it on a tour bus after watching a dance craze erupt at a Washington, D.C. show. It sold 1 million copies. Then came in early 1964, a Latin-tinted, irresistibly joyful groove that hit number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100. 6 nonsense syllables, one perfect song. Lance followed it with Hey Little Girl, The Matador, Rhythm, and Come See, a string of top 40 hits that made him one of the most charted R&B artists of the mid-60s. His backing vocalists on many of those tracks were the Impressions themselves, Curtis Mayfield's own group, singing behind his best friend.
I just couldn't help myself.
By 1972, the hits had dried up. Lance moved to England, where he became a hero on the Northern Soul circuit. He returned to America in 1974, settled in Atlanta, and signed with Playboy Records.
I was born with the curious mind.
Then in 1978, his life fell apart. He was convicted of selling cocaine and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. After his release, he played beach clubs on the Carolina coast, small venues, old songs, diminishing returns. In 1987, a heart attack ended even that. Glaucoma eventually left him nearly blind. On September 3, 1994, Major Lance died of heart disease in Decatur, Georgia. He was 55 years old. He had 9 children and almost no financial resources. His daughter, Keisha Lance Bottoms, later became the mayor of Atlanta. The man who sold 5.5 million records in the 1960s died in poverty in the same city his daughter would one day lead. Number 4, Billy Butler. There is a version of this story where Billy Butler is the most famous soul singer in Chicago. In that version, his mentor, Curtis Mayfield, doesn't leave him behind. His label gives his records the same promotion they give his famous brothers. His songs, which are genuinely brilliant, find the audience they deserve. That version didn't happen. Born William E. Butler on June 7, 1945, in Chicago's Cabrini Green housing projects. Billy was the younger brother of Jerry Butler, the Iceman, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee, one of the most respected figures in the history of American soul music. Billy learned guitar at age 12. His teacher and mentor was Curtis Mayfield himself. He formed a vocal group called the Enchanters while still in high school and walked into Carl Davis's OKeh office in 1963. Davis signed him immediately. Mayfield co-wrote and produced his debut single, Found True Love, on May 8, 1963. Over the next 3 years, Mayfield wrote a string of gorgeous songs for Billy. Nevertheless, You're Gonna Be Sorry, Does It Matter, records that should have been massive hits but kept getting lost in the machinery. Then came I Can't Work No Longer in June 1965, number 6 on the R&B chart, his biggest hit, and then Right Track in 1966, Urgent, Insistent, Beautifully Arranged, which reached number 24 R&B and became one of the most beloved Northern Soul records in British dance history. 60 years later, it is still ranked number 11 in the Northern Soul Top 500, still stopping floors at all-nighters across England. Billy left OKeh in 1967. He followed Carl Davis to Brunswick Records, formed a new group called Infinity, had a few minor R&B hits, and then slowly disappeared from the charts. He spent the last decades of his life playing guitar in his brother Jerry's band, writing songs for other people, quietly respected by everyone who truly understood soul music, but largely unknown to the mainstream audience that should have been his. Billy Butler died in Chicago on March 31st, 2015. He was 69 years old. His death was announced on April Fool's Day. Some of his fans refused to believe it was real. It was real, and it was quiet, the way his whole career was too great to be ignored, not famous enough to be saved. Number 3, Screamin Jay Hawkins. On September 12, 1956, in a recording studio in New York City, a Columbia Records executive named Arnold Maxon made a decision that would change music history. He brought a case of Italian Swiss colony Muscatel to the session. Screamin Jay Hawkins had recorded "I Put a Spell on You" once before as a gentle, refined love ballad on Grand Records in 1955. It wasn't released. Now he was re-recording it for Columbia's OKeh subsidiary, and Maxon had a specific vision.
2, 3.
"We all got blind drunk," Hawkins later told writer Nick Tosches. 10 days later, the record came out on the OKeh label. "I listened to it, and I heard all those drunken screams and groans and yells. And that's how I became Screamin Jay Hawkins." Born Jalasi J. Hawkins in Cleveland, Ohio on July 18, 1929, Jay had spent his early life as a serious musician, a trained classical pianist who studied at the Ohio Conservatory of Music, a boxer, a man who had performed with Fats Domino and Tiny Grimes. But "I Put a Spell on You," the screaming, grunting, cannibalistic OKeh version, was banned by radio stations across the country for its outrageous content, and it became one of the most covered songs in rock and roll history. Nina Simone covered it. Creedence Clearwater Revival covered it at Woodstock. Bette Midler sang it in Hocus Pocus. It was ranked on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time. And DJ Alan Freed dared Hawkins to climb out of a coffin at his next show. Hawkins had $300 in the bank. He took the dare, and for the next 4 decades, he performed in coffins, capes, and bonehead dresses, carrying a cigarette-smoking skull named Henry on a cane. The character consumed the musician, and the musician never got paid what he was owed. Hawkins spent the rest of his life on the touring circuit, a cult figure, a novelty act, a living legend that nobody knew how to market. He appeared in Jim Jarmusch's film Mystery Train and Bill Duke's A Rage in Harlem in the early 1990s, which introduced him to a new generation. He died on February 12, 2000, exactly 44 years after recording "I Put a Spell on You," of complications from surgery to repair an aneurysm. He was 70 years old. He died in Neuilly-sur-Seine, France. He was married 6 times. He reportedly fathered somewhere between 57 and 70 children. The estimates vary because no comprehensive record was ever kept. After his death, his biographer created a website called Jay's Kids to help locate them all. A man with 50-something children, a song on Rolling Stone's greatest list, a career spanning 44 years, and almost nothing to show for it financially when he died. Number 2, Chuck Willis's contemporary. Barbara Acklin. She wrote the songs that made other people famous, and then she died at 55, largely unknown. Born Barbara Jean Acklin in Oakland, California on February 28, 1943, Barbara moved to Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood as a child. By age 11, she was singing solos at New Zion Baptist Church. After graduating high school, she got a job as a secretary at St. Lawrence Records, just trying to stay close to the music. She sang backing vocals at Chess Records for Fontella Bass and Etta James' Invisible Work, her voice underneath everyone else's name. Then in 1966, she co-wrote a song called Whispers, Getting Louder, with David Scott. Jackie Wilson recorded it. It hit number 5 on R&B chart. Wilson himself then helped her get a recording contract at Brunswick Records, the same Chicago soul orbit as OKeh and Carl Davis. In 1968, Eugene recorded of the Chi-Lites, Carl Davis, arranger Sonny Sanders, and guitarist Gerald Sims co-wrote a song for her called Love Makes a Woman. The label released it as the B-side. DJs flipped it over. The record shot to number 3 on the R&B chart and number 15 on the Billboard Hot 100. It won a BMI award. It earned her a gold record. But here is the part that makes it truly extraordinary and truly devastating. Her 1969 single, Am I the Same Girl, reached number 33 R&B with Barbara's singing lead. Carl Davis then stripped her vocals from the track, replaced them with nothing, and released the instrumental as Soul Strut by Young Holt Unlimited. That instrumental version, the same track without Barbara, hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 in Canada. The same recording twice, both times a hit. One time with Barbara, one time without her. And without her, it went higher. As a songwriter, Barbara Acklin also co-wrote Have You Seen Her with Eugene Record in 1971, a multi-million selling hit for the Chi-Lites, and one of the most recognizable songs of the early 70s. She received songwriting royalties. But the recording side of her career generated money for labels and producers that never fully returned to her. Barbara Acklin died on November 27, 1998, in Omaha, Nebraska. She was 55 years old. The cause was a stroke. The First Lady of Brunswick Soul, the woman behind some of the greatest Chicago soul records ever made. Gone at 55, almost no mainstream obituary ran. Number 1. Major Lance's neighbor, Otis Leavill. This is the story of the man who made everyone else famous, and whom nobody remembers. Born Otis Leavill Cobb in Dewey Rose, Georgia in 1937, Otis moved to Chicago's Cabrini Green projects as a toddler. His father was a church pastor. His childhood best friend was Major Lance. We don't believe on your own. And growing up in the same building as Lance, Curtis Mayfield, Jerry Butler, and Billy Butler meant that Otis Leavill was surrounded by future greatness from the moment he could walk. As teenagers, Leavill and Lance boxed together at the gym. They sang together in a doo-wop group called the Floats. They dreamed together in the same cramped apartments. When Major Lance started climbing the charts at OKeh in 1963, Leavill was already in the building, working as a talent scout and assistant to Carl Davis. And there, in that office, at that label, in that era, Otis Leavill discovered some of the most important artists in Chicago soul history. He is credited with identifying and helping to develop the Chi-Lites, Tyrone Davis, Hamilton Bohannon, and a young singer named Yvette Stevens, who you know better as Chaka Khan. He passed on Chaka Khan. Someone else picked her up. She became one of the greatest voices of the 20th century, and Otis Leavill is a footnote in the story of how she was found. As a performer, Leavill spent most of the 1960s releasing scattered singles on Mercury, Smash, and Blue Rock, none of which charted nationally. When Carl Davis formed Dakar Records in 1967 and named Leavill vice president, something finally shifted. In 1969, Leavill recorded I Love You, written by OKeh Records of the Chi-Lites, with backing vocals from Record and Barbara Acklin. The record climbed to number 10 on the R&B chart, his biggest hit ever. The follow-up, Love Uprising, also written by OKeh Records, reached number 19 R&B and number 72 pop. 2 hits, one brief window, then the window closed. Otis Leavill spent the rest of his career in the background, scouting talent, advising artists, helping others find the success that kept eluding him. He died of a heart attack in Chicago in 2002. He was 65 years old. The soul world barely noticed. No major obituary, no tribute concert, no Hall of Fame induction. The man who helped build the Chi-Lites, found Tyrone Davis, and mentored some of the greatest voices in Chicago soul history, died as quietly as he had lived. Major Lance sold 5 million records and died in poverty. Otis Leavill helped create those records and died in obscurity. Sometimes the most painful stories in music aren't about the stars. They're about the people standing right next to them, making everything work, while history looks the other way.